She returned his engagement ring publicly, dropped it into his water glass in front of 600 people while her father started a standing ovation and her brother hit record on his phone. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the quiet man sitting at table 7 with water on his lapel had signed a $13 trillion oil deal 9 hours earlier that morning. Not a promotion, not a bonus. A $13 trillion sovereign energy agreement that made him, as of 9:47 that same morning, worth $4.1 billion. And every dollar of arrogance in that ballroom, the flowers, the open bar, the $84,000 room her father rented to celebrate his own greatness, was running, unknowingly, on something her husband controlled. They spent 15 years treating him like he came with the furniture. They had no idea he owned the building. What happens when the most powerful man in the room has spent a decade letting everyone believe he was the least important? And what happens when he finally decides, quietly, surgically, without raising his voice once, to let them find out? If this story is already doing something to you, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It helps more than you know. And if you are new here, subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. We drop new narratives every week. And before we go any further, drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Let us know you are here. Now let me take you all the way back to where this started, to a Thursday evening in Houston, Texas, inside a ballroom that cost more than most people's homes, where a man named Solomon Bridges straightened his jacket, picked up his water glass, and walked out of a room that had just made the most expensive mistake of its life. The valet took the car at 6:45, and Solomon Bridges walked through the front doors of the Houstonian Hotel like he had done 100 things like this before, because he had. Adrienne was already 3 steps ahead of him by the time they reached the lobby. That was nothing new either. The ballroom was the kind of room that announced itself before you entered it. The light spilled out into the corridor, warm and golden, and the sound of 400 conversations happening at once rolled toward them like a tide. 600 guests inside. Whitfield Group had rented the space for $84,000. Solomon knew the number because he had seen the invoice on the kitchen counter 2 weeks ago and said nothing about it, the way he said nothing about most things. Cornelius Whitfield was stationed just inside the entrance, the way a man stations himself at the door of something he built. He was 68 years old and dressed in a black tuxedo that cost more than most people's mortgage payments, and when he saw Adrienne, he opened his arms and said her name like it was an announcement. When he saw Solomon behind her, he nodded once, the way you nod at a door you are holding open for someone. Solomon nodded back. He was used to the nod. The room was everything the Whitfield family believed about themselves made physical. Round tables draped in ivory linen, centerpieces taller than the seated guests, a stage at the far end with a podium and a screen cycling through Whitfield Group's 30-year history in slow dissolves. The energy industry's Houston contingent was well represented. There were city council members. There were people whose names appeared on buildings. There was an open bar that had been running since 6 o'clock, and a past appetizer that Solomon recognized as a crab cake, because Adrienne's family served crab cakes at every event that was supposed to impress someone. He found his seat without being told. Table 7. Not the family table, which was table 1, front and center, where Adrienne was already sitting between her father and her Aunt Patricia. Table 7 was near the back, close to the service entrance, populated by industry contacts who were important enough to invite and unimportant enough to seat accordingly. Solomon introduced himself to the 2 men beside him, shook their hands, and settled into his chair with the quiet ease of a man who did not need the room to notice him. Trevor found him anyway. Adrienne's brother was 37 and had their father's jaw and none of their father's discipline, and he arrived at table 7 with a drink in one hand and his phone in the other, like he had been looking for Solomon specifically. He had. He pulled out the chair across from Solomon, turned it backward, and sat on it the way men sit on chairs when they want you to know they are not staying. He said something about Solomon's suit, something about how it was a good suit for a government employee. He said it with the smile he always used, the one that was supposed to tell you it was a joke. Solomon said, "Thank you." Trevor laughed and went back to the family table, phone already up, already filming something. The dinner was served. The program began. Cornelius took the stage for remarks, and the room gave him the kind of attention that rooms give to men who have earned it or bought it, and in Cornelius's case it had always been some of both. He spoke about the firm's 30-year legacy. He spoke about the future. He used the word excellence 4 times in 6 minutes, and every time he said it, the people at table 1 leaned in a little closer. Solomon ate his salmon. The awards portion began around 9 o'clock. A Whitfield Group vice president took the podium and began working through a list of client acknowledgements. Solomon poured himself a second glass of water. The Field Journal was in his inside jacket pocket, the way it always was, worn brown leather pressing gently against his ribs. He had written 3 words in it that morning after Harold shook his hand. He had not needed to write anything more than that. Then Adrienne was at the microphone. She had not told anyone in that room she was going to do this except the people who mattered to her, and Solomon Bridges was not among them. She stood at the podium in the wine-coloured dress she had bought for this occasion, and she spoke clearly and without hesitation, the way she spoke when she had rehearsed something enough times that it no longer felt like something she was saying, but something she simply was. She said she had retained a divorce attorney. She said it was time for a change. She said she wanted to thank everyone for their understanding and their support. Then she walked to table 7, picked up Solomon's left hand, and placed the ring in his water glass. The sound it made was very small. Cornelius Whitfield rose from table 1 and began to applaud. The room followed him the way rooms follow men like that. Trevor had his phone up before Adrienne finished the last sentence, and the LinkedIn post was live before Solomon stood. Solomon stood. He buttoned the top button of his jacket without looking down. He reached into his inside pocket and touched the spine of the Field Journal once. The way you touch something you know is there. Then he walked out of the ballroom, through the service corridor, retrieved his car from the valet, and drove home alone through the dark Houston streets with the jacket still on and the journal still inside it. He did not turn on the radio. He did not call anyone. He drove in the particular silence of a man who has already decided how the story ends and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. To understand what happened at that ballroom, you have to go back further. You have to go back to where Solomon Bridges began, and more importantly, where the Whitfield family decided he would end. Solomon met Adrienne in the fall of 2009 at Rice University in a geology seminar that she was auditing for an elective credit, and he was attending because the Earth's subsurface structures were the only thing in his life that had ever made complete and total sense to him. He was 26 years old, on a full academic scholarship, the first person in his family to leave Compton for anything other than a job. She was 24, bright and beautiful, and trailing the particular confidence of a woman who had never once had to negotiate for a seat at any table she wanted. They were married in 2010. The Whitfield family paid for the wedding. That fact would never be allowed to disappear. Cornelius Whitfield had built his petroleum consulting firm from a one-room office in Midtown Houston into a $280 million a year enterprise, and in doing so he had arrived at a personal philosophy that was as simple as it was iron. A man's worth could be measured, and the measurement was precise. Where you came from, what your family name carried, what you had accumulated and could display. By those metrics, Solomon Bridges registered as almost nothing Compton, no family name in the industry, a scholarship boy with a government-adjacent job title that Cornelius could never quite remember correctly. The first time Solomon came to the Whitfield home for Sunday dinner, Cornelius shook his hand at the door and said, in front of Adrienne and her Aunt Patricia and 2 family friends, that it was good of Adrienne to bring someone from the community. He said it pleasantly. He said it like a compliment. Solomon said thank you and went inside and ate the pot roast and said very little and drove home afterward with his hands steady on the wheel. That was how it would always go. Over the years, the diminishments became a kind of weather system that Solomon learned to simply move through. At Whitfield Group holiday parties, Cornelius introduced him to colleagues as Adrienne's husband. Full stop. No profession offered, no context given, as if Solomon's existence began and ended in relation to his wife. At family dinners, when the conversation turned to business, acquisitions, energy contracts, market positions, the men at the table spoke directly to each other and around Solomon, the way you speak around a piece of furniture you have grown accustomed to. His career title, when anyone acknowledged it at all, was described as something government-adjacent, something to do with energy analysis, something low stakes and forgettable. Trevor had a name for him that circulated in the family's inner ring. Not to his face, not always, but consistently enough that Solomon had heard it by the 3rd year. The name was Quiet Money. It was Trevor's way of saying that Solomon had just enough to not embarrass Adrienne publicly and not nearly enough to belong. He said it with a smile, the way he said everything cruel, wrapped in a joke so thin you could see straight through it. And Adrienne, who had loved Solomon once with something real. Adrienne, who knew better. She never corrected her father. She never interrupted Trevor. When Solomon was talked over at dinner, she did not redirect the conversation back to him. When Cornelius introduced him without a title, she did not supply one. She had made a calculation somewhere in the first 2 years of marriage, perhaps earlier, and the calculation was that her family's approval was worth more than her husband's dignity, and she had never revisited the math. In 2019, Whitfield Group hosted its first major industry recognition gala. The Houston Energy Consultants Association had named the firm's flagship analytical product, the Whitfield Subsurface Intelligence Report, the most significant industry tool of the preceding decade. Cornelius stood at a podium in a ballroom very much like the one Solomon would stand in 4 years later, and he accepted the award with a speech about rigor and vision and the courage to build something from nothing. Solomon was in the audience at a side table. He sat with his jacket on and his hands folded, and he listened to every word of that speech. He knew, in a way that Cornelius did not and could not, exactly what the Whitfield Subsurface Intelligence Report was built on. He had been licensing his own geological survey data to Whitfield Group anonymously through Meridian Data Partners for 7 months by that point, below market rate, quietly structured, renewable annually. The data inside that award-winning product was his. The methodology that Cornelius was describing as the firm's own intellectual achievement had been built on survey work that Solomon had completed personally over 5 years in the field. He did not stand up, he did not say anything to Adrienne on the drive home. When they got back to the house, she went upstairs and he sat at his desk in the home office and opened the field journal and wrote 3 lines in the shorthand that only he and Harold Fontaine had ever been able to read. Then he closed it, set it in his jacket pocket, and went to bed. The journal had been filling for 9 years by that Thursday evening at the Houstonian, page after page of it, and what it contained would have dismantled everything the Whitfield family believed about themselves. Every award, every credential, every standing ovation, right down to the foundation. What the Whitfield family never understood about Solomon Bridges was that his silence was not emptiness, it was architecture. The title on his business card said, Senior Acquisitions Analyst, Pacific Rim Energy Consortium. That was true. It was also the smallest true thing about him. What the title did not say, what no business card in any pocket of any jacket Solomon owned had ever said, was that he had spent 9 years quietly acquiring subsurface mineral rights across 4 West African coastal territories, building a network of transit infrastructure holdings through a Delaware entity called Bridges Mineral Trust, and positioning himself as the indispensable private broker in what would become the largest sovereign energy agreement in the history of the continent. He had incorporated Bridges Mineral Trust in the spring of 2014, 2 years before the wedding. He had done it on a Tuesday afternoon in Harold Fontaine's Washington office, signed the documents with a pen Harold had set on the table without ceremony, and driven back to Houston the same evening. Adrienne had asked him how the trip was. He had said fine. They had eaten dinner. He had written 4 lines in the field journal before bed. That was how it always went with Solomon, quietly, precisely, without announcement. The Meridian Data Partners arrangement began in 2019, and it was, from a structural standpoint, elegant in the way that truly dangerous things often are. Meridian was a legitimate DC-based data brokerage that Harold used for several clients, and, through Meridian, Solomon licensed his own proprietary geological survey data to Whitfield Group as an anonymous third-party subscription. The data was real. It was Solomon's. It represented years of field work across basin formations that Cornelius Whitfield's team had neither the expertise nor the access to produce independently, and Solomon priced it below market, renewed it without escalation, and never once indicated that the quiet man eating pot roast at the family table on Sundays was the source of Whitfield Group's most celebrated analytical product. He did it because of Adrienne. That was the part that mattered. He had built the trust before the marriage, and he had kept it separate and protected, but the license was different. The license was an act of love that no one would ever recognize as one. If the marriage ended badly, if things fell apart in ways he could see coming even then, he wanted Adrienne to have something. He wanted the firm her father had built to remain standing. He wanted her inheritance intact, her professional world secure, her name unsullied by whatever happened between them personally. He renewed the license in 2020. He renewed it in 2021. He renewed it again in 2022. Each year, Harold sent the paperwork and Solomon signed it without hesitation, the way you do something you have decided about completely. In the fall of 2022, Cornelius accepted his 3rd consecutive Houston Energy Excellence Award, this one specifically citing the Whitfield Subsurface Intelligence Report as the industry's gold standard for geological data accuracy. He gave a 12-minute speech. He mentioned the firm's proprietary methodology. He mentioned the team he had built. He did not mention Meridian Data Partners because he did not know Meridian Data Partners was the foundation the whole thing was standing on. He thanked his family from the stage, which in Cornelius's usage meant his children, which in practice meant Trevor and Adrienne, which in practice did not mean Solomon. Solomon was not at that ceremony. He was in Dakar in a conference room with representatives from the Senegalese Ministry of Petroleum, reviewing the 3rd draft of an infrastructure transit agreement that Harold had been quietly architecting for 7 months. At Thanksgiving that year, Trevor told a story at the dinner table about a colleague who had married beneath himself and spent a decade paying for it. He told it looking at Solomon. He laughed at the end. The table laughed with him. Adrienne refilled her glass of sweet tea and said nothing, and did not look at her husband. Solomon passed the cornbread to his left and said nothing. 3 weeks before the gala, Harold sent the annual Meridian renewal packet. Solomon opened it at his desk in the Home Office on a Wednesday night, while the television played gospel music low in the background, the way his mother had always kept it. He read the documents the way he always read them. He set the pen on the desk, and then for the first time in 4 consecutive years, he did not pick it up. He sat with that decision for a long time, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood what it meant, and he wanted to feel the full weight of it before he moved forward. Then he closed the file. He placed the field journal in his jacket pocket. He opened his laptop and booked 2 flights to Houston, one for himself, one for Adrienne, departing the following Thursday morning. The next morning he would sign something that would change everything. And nobody in his wife's family, nobody at that dinner table, nobody in that $84,000 ballroom would understand what had happened until it was already done and there was nothing left to stop. Pacing begins to accelerate from this chapter forward. The slow burn is over. Harold Fontaine's Houston offices occupied the 14th floor of a building on Westheimer Road that had no signage on the street and no listing in the lobby directory. That was intentional. Harold had designed his practice for clients who required discretion above all else, and over 26 years he had built a reputation in energy law that moved entirely by referral, entirely by trust, and entirely below the level at which people like Cornelius Whitfield operated. Cornelius had never heard of Harold Fontaine. That too was intentional. Solomon arrived at 9 on the dot. Harold was already at the conference table with the documents laid out in 3 organized stacks, a yellow legal pad to his left, and 2 cups of coffee placed precisely equidistant from the edge. He had known Solomon since Rice University. He did not greet him with small talk. He gestured to the chair across the table and said they should begin. The agreement before them represented 7 years of negotiation, 2 years of infrastructure acquisition, and 9 years of geological survey work that Solomon had conducted personally across basin formations stretching from the Senegalese coast through Cameroonian deep-water territory into the Gulf of Guinea. The Pacific Rim Energy Consortium had served as the institutional face. 3 sovereign governments, Senegal, Cameroon, and Ghana, had signed their respective framework agreements over the preceding 14 months. What remained were Solomon's personal broker documents, the final transfer of his infrastructure holdings into the consolidated entity, and the last signature that would close the largest private energy brokerage agreement in the history of the continent. $13 trillion. Harold walked through each document section by section, the way he always did, unhurried and precise, his finger moving along the margins as he spoke. The transit terminals, the pipeline right-of-way holdings, the deep-water platform access agreements, the royalty structure that positioned Bridges Mineral Trust as the permanent infrastructure intermediary for the full output life cycle of the surveyed basin. He explained that Solomon's personal net worth, upon execution, would be $4.1 billion, fully structured within the premarital trust and entirely outside the scope of any divorce proceeding. He said this not as reassurance, but as legal fact, the way he said all legal facts, without inflection or decoration. Solomon listened without interrupting. He had heard most of this before in increments, over 7 years of phone calls and document reviews. But hearing it assembled in its complete form, in a single room, on a single morning, had a weight to it that the incremental version never quite carried. Harold set the pen on the table at 9:44. Solomon picked it up at 9:47 and signed his name across the final signature line of the broker agreement, the trust transfer document, and the infrastructure consolidation filing. 3 signatures, 32 seconds. Harold reached across the table and shook his hand once, firmly, and said, "Well done." That was the entirety of the celebration. Neither man needed more than that. Harold gathered the documents into the filing folders and then set his hands flat on the table and asked the only remaining question with any open answer. He asked about Whitfield Group. He asked about the Meridian license that had not been renewed. He asked about the gala that evening and whether Solomon intended to change any part of the plan. Solomon thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not very long. He said he would attend the gala. He said he would do nothing that night. He said Harold should begin positioning on Monday morning quietly through the established channels and that the sequence they had discussed should proceed exactly as planned. Harold nodded and wrote 2 lines on his legal pad. He did not ask why Solomon wanted to attend. He had known Solomon long enough to understand that some decisions were not strategic. Some were simply human. Solomon reached into his jacket and placed the field journal on the conference table. It landed with the soft, substantial sound of something that had been carried a very long time. Harold looked at it the way he always looked at it, with the particular recognition of a man who understood exactly what it contained, because he had spent years translating its shorthand into the legal language of binding agreements. Solomon put it back in his pocket and stood. He took the long way home. He stopped at a coffee shop on Montrose, where the gospel station played low from a small speaker behind the counter, and the woman at the register called him baby the way his grandmother used to, without irony or affectation. He sat at a corner table for 20 minutes and drank his coffee and looked out the window at the ordinary Thursday morning traffic of a city that had no idea what had just happened 14 floors above Westheimer Road. He drove home. He hung the charcoal suit on the back of the bathroom door, the way Adrienne preferred. He showered, he dressed. He was ready by 6:30. He would sit in that ballroom for 4 hours, and he would know exactly what he knew. And that patience, that final act of stillness, was not weakness. It never had been. It was the last deliberate choice of a man who had already decided how the story ended, and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. Solomon was back in Harold's office by 8:30 Monday morning. He had flown to DC Friday night and back Sunday afternoon, and he sat across from Harold now in the same chair he had occupied 4 days earlier, in the same building, at the same conference table, looking exactly the same as he always looked. Calm, present, unhurried. The field journal was in his jacket pocket. It was always in his jacket pocket. Harold set a legal pad on the table and asked him to describe the gala. Solomon described it the way he described most things, precisely, without editorializing, in the order that it happened. Arrival at 6:45. Seated at table 7. Trevor filming before anything occurred. Adrienne at the microphone. The ring in the water glass. Cornelius standing. The LinkedIn post, Liv, before he reached the valet. He recounted all of it in the same measured tone a man might use to describe a flight delay. Not because he felt nothing, but because he had already decided that feeling was not the tool required for what came next. Harold listened without interrupting. When Solomon finished, Harold wrote 2 words on the legal pad and turned it 90 degrees so Solomon could read them. The words were, "Proceed fully." Solomon nodded once. Harold set down the pen and walked through the 4 moves in sequence. He had prepared them over the weekend, which was not unusual. Harold Fontaine did not require much lead time when the architecture was already in place, and the only remaining question was timing. The first move was the Meridian notice. A formal non-renewal communication from Meridian Data Partners to Whitfield Group, issued through standard channels, effective immediately, with a 90-day wind-down period. The letter would arrive as certified mail at Whitfield Group's Greenway Plaza headquarters. It would identify the data license by account number only. The license holder would be listed as Bridges Mineral Trust. To anyone at Whitfield Group who investigated, Bridges Mineral Trust would resolve to a Delaware shell entity with no public officers, no website, and no searchable history. A wall of legal nothing. The second move was the Gulf Atlantic due diligence flag. Harold controlled a third-party energy compliance firm called Trescott Advisory Services that operated entirely for his clients' purposes. Trescott would submit an anonymous data integrity inquiry to Gulf Atlantic Energy Partners merger due diligence team, specifically questioning the provenance and continuity of the Whitfield Group analytical product line. Gulf Atlantic's legal team would be obligated to investigate before the merger could proceed. If Whitfield Group could not demonstrate clean, continuous data ownership, the merger would stall, and it would not unstall. The third move was Trevor's Fund. The Gulf Coast Mineral Rights Fund that Solomon had quietly ceded as a favor to Trevor in 2021 had always operated under Harold's fiduciary oversight through a managing partner arrangement. The managing partner would issue a 72-hour redemption notice to all minority investors under a standard portfolio restructuring provision. Trevor would receive a check for his full $1.2 million position and a letter with no explanation. He would not be able to trace it. There was nothing to trace. The fourth move was the divorce asset documentation. Adrienne's attorney had already filed the initial discovery requests. Harold would respond through standard legal channels with a complete Bridges Mineral Trust documentation, the pre-marital incorporation date, the full asset inventory, the trust structure, every property, every account, every mineral rights holding, time-stamped to 2014 and beyond. Adrienne's attorney would open that package and understand immediately that there was nothing to claim because there had never been anything to claim. Solomon listened to all four moves without expression. When Harold finished, he asked one question. He asked whether any of it could be traced back to him directly, not through the trust, but by name. Harold said no. He said it the way he said most things, flatly and with finality, like a door closing on a room you would not need to re-enter. Solomon said to proceed. He did not say it with anger. He did not say it with satisfaction. He said it the way you say a true thing when the time has finally come to say it, with the quiet authority of a man who has been patient for longer than patience was reasonable, and has now simply decided to be done. Harold wrote 4 lines on his legal pad, tore the sheet off, and set it face down on the desk beside him. He would handle everything from here. That was always how it worked between them. Solomon provided the architecture, and Harold provided the machinery, and together they had built something that had taken 15 years and that would take approximately 15 business days to dismantle everything the Whitfield family had constructed their identity around. At 10:58 Monday morning, Solomon Bridges walked out of Harold Fontaine's office on Westheimer Road, rode the elevator to the lobby, and stepped into a car headed to George Bush Intercontinental Airport. He had a 1:30 flight to Washington and a full week of consortium meetings beginning Tuesday. At 11 o'clock exactly, Harold sent the first notice. In his Greenway Plaza office, Cornelius Whitfield was in a meeting with 3 of his senior partners, reviewing projections for the Gulf Atlantic merger close. The certified letter was sitting on his assistant's desk, waiting to be opened. It had been there since 10:45. Cornelius had no idea it existed. He had no framework for what it meant, and he had no way of knowing that the world he had spent 30 years building was already, at that precise moment, beginning to come apart. The letter arrived at Whitfield Group's Greenway Plaza front desk at 10:45 on a Tuesday morning. Certified mail. A Meridian Data Partners return address. Cornelius's assistant signed for it, placed it in his message tray, and went back to her desk without giving it a second thought. Cornelius opened it at 2 in the afternoon between meetings. He read it once, then he read it again. Then he set it on his desk and picked up his phone and called his operations director and told him to get the legal team in the conference room by 3 o'clock. The letter was 11 sentences long. It identified the data license by account number, stated that Meridian Data Partners had been instructed by the license holder that the agreement would not be renewed upon its current term expiration, and outlined a 90-day wind-down period during which Whitfield Group's existing access would be maintained on a read-only basis. That was all. No reason given, no contact name, no negotiation pathway offered. Cornelius told the legal team it was a vendor dispute and to sort it out by end of week. The legal team could not sort it out by end of week. The license holder, identified in the account documentation as Bridges Mineral Trust, resolved to a Delaware limited liability company with no public-facing officers, no registered website, no industry listings, and no searchable presence in any energy database Whitfield Group had access to. The Meridian contact who had managed the account for 4 years told Whitfield Group's general counsel that he had no authority to reverse the non-renewal decision and that it had come directly from the license holder. He said he was sorry. He said there was nothing else he could tell them. Cornelius called Trevor into his office Thursday morning. Trevor spent 45 minutes on his laptop, running every search variation he could think of on Bridges Mineral Trust, Delaware Secretary of State Database, Energy Industry Registries, LinkedIn. He found nothing. A wall of nothing, clean and absolute, like the entity had been built specifically to resist exactly this kind of search. He told his father the name was a ghost. Cornelius did not like that answer. Without the Meridian data feed, Whitfield Group's Q4 client reports could not be completed. The reports were built on the subsurface analytics that the data license provided. Without it, the methodology that Cornelius had spent 3 years presenting to clients as proprietary had no foundation. 6 major client reports, each valued at $2 million per engagement, were now effectively stalled. Gulf Coast Refinery Partners called on Thursday afternoon to ask about a delivery timeline. Cornelius told his assistant to say the report was in final review. He said it with the confidence of a man who did not yet understand how deep the problem went. He called Adrienne that evening. He told her something had come up with a data vendor and asked if Solomon had ever mentioned anything about a company called Bridges Mineral Trust. Adrienne said she had never heard that name. She called Solomon immediately after she hung up with her father. She called him twice. He did not answer either time. She texted him. He did not respond. Friday morning, Gulf Atlantic Energy Partners legal team sent a formal inquiry to Whitfield Group's deal counsel. The inquiry referenced a data integrity flag that had been raised through a third-party compliance submission. It asked Whitfield Group to provide documentation demonstrating the chain of ownership, continuity, and licensing rights for the subsurface analytical data underlying the firm's flagship product. The inquiry noted that the due diligence process for the $900 million merger could not advance until the documentation was received and reviewed. Cornelius read the Gulf Atlantic letter standing at his desk. He read it 3 times. He called his attorney, a man named Eldridge Tatum, who had handled Whitfield Group's corporate matters for 12 years. Eldridge told him clearly and without softening it that if the data could not be resourced or the license holder could not be identified and brought to the table, the merger timeline was in serious jeopardy. He said Gulf Atlantic's legal team was precise and well-resourced and would not proceed on incomplete documentation. He said Cornelius needed to find out who Bridges Mineral Trust was. Cornelius said he was working on it. He was not working on it. He had no mechanism to work on it. He had a name attached to a Delaware shell and a Meridian account that had been anonymously managed for 4 years through channels he had never examined because he had never needed to. He had accepted the data as a vendor subscription the way you accept electricity. without asking where it came from. Friday evening, after his staff had gone home, Cornelius Whitfield sat alone in his corner office on the 14th floor of the Greenway Plaza building and looked out at the Houston skyline he had watched himself rise into over 30 years. The office was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before, not peaceful, hollow. He did not know what Bridges Mineral Trust was. He did not know who controlled it. He did not know why, 10 days after his daughter publicly ended her marriage in his ballroom, a data license that his entire product line depended on had silently ceased to exist. He did not know any of it yet. But 72 hours from that moment, a single newspaper article would make everything devastatingly clear, and the name on the license would stop being a ghost and become something far worse. Gulf Atlantic pulled out on a Monday morning. No negotiation. No extension request. A single letter from their lead counsel to Whitfield Group's deal team citing unresolvable data provenance issues and formally withdrawing from the $900 million merger agreement. 18 months of work, Cornelius's entire retirement architecture, gone in 11 sentences. Cornelius called his attorney. His attorney said he had expected this. That same Monday, 6 of Whitfield Group's major clients sent formal holds on their quarterly report engagements. 2 of them cited the Gulf Atlantic news specifically. The other 4 cited their own internal compliance requirements pending data source clarification. $12 million in expected Q4 revenue. Suspended. Not cancelled yet, suspended. The difference between those 2 words would not survive the next 30 days. Tuesday, Trevor's phone rang. It was the managing partner of the Gulf Coast Mineral Rights Fund. The call lasted 4 minutes. When Trevor hung up, he sat at his desk and stared at the wall. A redemption check for $1.2 million was being processed. His entire position in the fund had been liquidated under a standard portfolio restructuring provision. No explanation offered, no recourse available. He called Cornelius. Cornelius had no answers. He called Adrienne. Adrienne had no answers either. None of them had answers. That was the point. Wednesday morning, Adrienne's attorney sat across from her in a conference room and opened a manila folder and placed a 12-page document summary on the table. She explained it slowly. Every significant marital asset and the Tanglewood home, 3 investment accounts, mineral rights holdings in Louisiana and West Texas, was held entirely within Bridges Mineral Trust, a Delaware entity established in April of 2014. 2 years before the wedding, the trust predated the marriage entirely. Under Texas family law, with the structure Harold had constructed, there was nothing to claim. Adrienne's attorney used the word airtight. She said it once and did not soften it. Adrienne asked what that meant for the house. Her attorney told her it meant the house was not hers. Thursday, Whitfield Group's chief financial officer presented Cornelius with an internal solvency projection. Without the merger proceeds and without the client renewals, the firm would reach functional insolvency within 18 months. The projection assumed modest revenue recovery. It assumed the data issue would eventually be resolved. Even with those assumptions, the numbers did not hold. Cornelius read the document twice, set it face down on his desk and did not speak for several minutes. Friday morning, the Financial Times published. The headline read, Houston geologist Solomon Bridges brokers historic $13 trillion agreement. The article ran 14 paragraphs. It detailed the Pacific Rim Energy Consortium's West Africa sovereign infrastructure deal. It named Solomon Bridges as the lead independent broker. It described Bridges Mineral Trust as the private holding entity controlling the transit infrastructure at the center of the agreement. It included a photograph of Solomon in a conference room that Adrienne recognized immediately as being on Westheimer Road. Trevor read the article at his desk at 9 in the morning. He searched Bridges Mineral Trust. This time, the search returned results. The Financial Times article, 2 trade publication mentions, a brief consortium press release, and a corporate registration document from the state of Delaware dated April 2014, listing the registered agent for Bridges Mineral Trust. Trevor sat very still. He searched Solomon Bridges. He searched Pacific Rim Energy Consortium. He searched the Meridian Data Partners account number from the non-renewal letter his father had shown him the week before. Everything connected at once, like a bolt snapping into place in a lock that had been sitting open for 15 years. He called Cornelius. He said the words slowly, the way you say something you have no framework for. He said, "The data license, the trust, the merger, Solomon." He said all of it is the same person, Pop. Cornelius did not respond for a long time. Adrienne saw the Financial Times article at 11 that morning. She saw it because her phone was already ringing from 4 different people who had seen it first. She read it standing in her kitchen in the Tanglewood house that was not legally her house. She read it twice. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the date the trust was incorporated. Then she opened LinkedIn. Her post was already detonating, 6,200 comments and climbing. Her caption, "Sometimes you have to know your worth," sat above the fastest growing comment section on the platform that morning. She tried to delete the post. The delete function seemed to load forever. By the time it processed, the screenshots were already everywhere. She called Solomon. He answered on the second ring. She did not know what to say. She said his name. She said she had seen the article. Solomon said, "Harold will be in touch." Then he ended the call. Adrienne stood in her kitchen with the phone in her hand and the LinkedIn notification still coming, and the Financial Times article still open on her screen. And for the first time in 15 years of marriage to Solomon Bridges, she understood exactly who she had been sitting across from at every dinner table, every Sunday gathering, every family event where someone introduced him wrong, and she had said nothing. She understood the full geometry of it, and there was not a single thing left to do with that understanding except wait for Harold to be in touch. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the Financial Times article and 5 weeks after the gala. Harold's conference room. Both attorneys present. Formal asset disclosure under the divorce proceedings. No family, no audience, just 4 people in a room, and the truth that had been building for 15 years. Adrienne arrived first with her attorney, a sharp woman named Vanessa Cole, who had handled high-asset divorces in Houston for 20 years and believed she had seen every configuration this kind of meeting could take. She set her legal pad on the table and arranged her documents and prepared, as she always did, to lead. Solomon arrived at 10 o'clock exactly. He wore the same kind of suit he always wore, dark, understated. He carried nothing in his hands. He sat down across from Adrienne without looking at her for more than a moment, reached into his inside jacket pocket, and placed the field journal on the table between them. The brown leather was worn soft at the corners. It landed with the quiet weight of something that had travelled very far. Adrienne looked at it the way you look at something you have seen 1,000 times and are only now beginning to understand. Vanessa Cole opened the session with a procedural summary of the Asset Disclosure Framework. She was thorough and precise, and she spoke for approximately 90 seconds before Harold Fontaine set his pen down flat on the table and said quietly that he would like to give Solomon the floor. Vanessa Cole looked at Harold. Harold looked back at her with the particular patience of a man who has never once been uncertain in a conference room. She stopped talking. Solomon looked at Adrienne. He did not look at the table, or the journal, or the lawyers. He looked at her directly, the way he had always done when he had something real to say, which had not been often enough for either of them to notice until now. He spoke for 4 minutes. His voice did not rise once. He said that he was not going to talk about what she did at the gala because it did not require discussion. He said he understood it. He said what he wanted to do before this chapter closed was make sure she understood the full picture of what she had been living inside, because she deserved that, and because it was the last thing he intended to give her. He said in 2019, a data brokerage called Meridian Data Partners began supplying Whitfield Group with subsurface geological survey data. That data was licensed anonymously through Bridges Mineral Trust. Bridges Mineral Trust is my company. I incorporated it in Delaware in April of 2014. I have owned it entirely and exclusively since then. Every report your father sold as proprietary Whitfield Group analysis since 2019 was built on my survey work. Every award he accepted for analytical excellence, every $2 million client engagement, every claim of proprietary methodology, all of it was mine. I priced the license below market and renewed it every single year because your financial security was tied to that firm's health, and I was not willing to let you lose that because of what was happening between us. Adrienne did not move. He said, "The house in Tanglewood, the investment accounts, the mineral rights in Louisiana and West Texas, all of it has been held in Bridges Mineral Trust since before we were married. There is nothing in the marriage to claim because I structured it that way from the beginning. Not to trap you, to protect myself the same way any intelligent person protects themselves before they are certain what the future holds. You have a fair settlement coming. Harold will make sure of that. You will be financially stable. That was always the intention, even now." Vanessa Cole had stopped writing. Her pen was resting against the pad at an angle that suggested she had set it down mid-sentence and not picked it back up. Solomon reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small, clear Ziploc bag on the table beside the journal. The ring was inside it, catching the light the way it had the night she dropped it in his water glass. He said, "You can have this back if you want it. It is yours." Then he said the thing that the room had been waiting for, in the same quiet voice he had used for every word before it. He said, "You spent 15 years apologizing to your father for marrying me, Adrienne. But what you did not know was, your father's company has been running on my work since 2019, and I kept renewing the license every single year because I loved you. I stopped 3 weeks ago. I signed the deal that morning. You put the ring in my glass 9 hours later." The room held that sentence for a long time. Adrienne did not respond. She did not cry. She sat very still in the way people sit when the full architecture of something enormous has just landed on them, and their body has not yet found a way to process it. Solomon closed the field journal. He stood. He buttoned the top button of his jacket the way he always did. He looked at Harold once, and Harold gave him the smallest nod. Then he walked out of the conference room and did not look back. The field journal stayed on the table. He did not need it anymore. Everything it contained had already happened. Outside Harold's building, a car was waiting. Solomon got in, and it pulled into the Houston noon traffic. And behind him, a family was finally, quietly, beginning to understand the full cost of spending 15 years confusing a man's silence with his ceiling. 8 months later, the world had rearranged itself into its permanent new shape, and Solomon Bridges was at peace with every corner of it. Whitfield Group restructured in the spring. Cornelius's attorneys negotiated a debt-for-equity arrangement with the firm's 3 primary lenders that valued the company at roughly 30 cents on each dollar it had been worth the previous November. The industry noticed. Nobody said much publicly, because the energy consulting world is small and has a long memory, and the story of what had happened to Whitfield Group's flagship data product had circulated through the right channels in the kind of whisper that is more devastating than any headline. Cornelius Whitfield announced his retirement in April in a 2-paragraph statement that mentioned legacy and transition and said nothing about data provenance. The standing ovation he had started in that ballroom was the last time a room full of industry peers would ever rise for him. Trevor left Houston in March. He sold the River Oaks condo at a loss, took a regional sales director position with a mid-sized commercial real estate firm in Dallas, and stopped posting on LinkedIn entirely. The video of the gala ring return lived on in screenshots across a dozen platforms. It had his voice on it, narrating approvingly, and there was no version of the future in which that audio disappeared. He understood that now. He had filmed a monument to his own blind contempt, and the internet had decided it was permanent. Adrienne relocated to Atlanta in February. She took a position with a non-profit arts foundation, which was a clean break from everything petroleum adjacent, and she set her LinkedIn to private the week the Financial Times story ran, and never made it public again. The post with 6,200 comments existed in perpetuity in screenshots across the internet. She could not undo it. She had learned at considerable cost that the audience she had always performed for was not the one that mattered. The divorce finalized quietly in January. Solomon had instructed Harold to structure Adrienne's settlement generously. She walked away with a cash settlement of $2 million, a paid-off vehicle, and a clean financial start. Nothing she had a legal claim to, but everything Solomon had decided she deserved anyway, because vindication and cruelty are not the same thing, and Solomon Bridges had never confused the two. Harold had thought the settlement was more than necessary. Solomon had said it was exactly necessary and had not revisited the conversation. The Bridges Mineral Foundation was announced in June, without a press release, in a single post on the foundation's website. The endowment was $40 million. The scholarship program funded geoscience education for students from Compton, from Shreveport, and from communities along the Mississippi Delta, places where the ground held wealth that the people above it had never been given the tools to find. The first cohort was 14 scholars. 2 were from Compton specifically, from the same zip code Solomon had grown up in, and when the local paper ran a short story about the foundation, his mother called him and cried for 10 minutes and then told him to eat something. At the foundation's first event, held at a community center in Compton on a Saturday morning in July, Solomon stood at a small podium in front of 60 people, scholars, parents, a few local educators, and spoke for 8 minutes without notes. He was not performing. He was just talking to the room. The Field Journal sat on the podium beside him, worn and brown and present, the way it had always been present everywhere he went, in every room where no one had thought to ask what was inside it. He was introduced correctly for the first time in a very long time by someone who had actually looked up what he did. After the event, at a small gathering at a colleague's home in northwest Washington, Solomon was sitting near a window with a glass of water when a woman sat down across from him and asked about the journal. Not dismissively, not as a joke. She looked at it on the table between them and asked what it was for. Her name was Naomi Cole. She was an environmental attorney, Howard Law, DC-based practice, and she asked the question with the direct, unhurried curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to know the answer and was prepared to listen to the whole thing. Solomon told her. He started with the first survey he had ever logged in 2006 on a coastal formation in Senegal that nobody else had thought was worth examining. He told her about the shorthand he had developed because Harold was the only other person he trusted to read it. He told her about the first time he brought the journal to a family dinner, and someone called it a little diary. He told her about the last entry he had written in it, in a conference room in Houston on a Thursday morning in November. 3 words in a shorthand that translated, roughly, to, "It is done." Naomi listened to all of it without interrupting once. When Solomon finished, she asked one more question. She asked what the 3 words were in the shorthand. He told her. She nodded slowly, the way you nod when something lands exactly where it was supposed to land. And then she refilled his water glass without being asked, and they kept talking until the room had mostly emptied around them. That night, back at his hotel, Solomon opened a new journal. The spine cracked softly as he laid it flat on the desk. The first page was completely blank, waiting in the way that only new things wait, without the weight of everything that came before. He wrote 1 line, then he closed it. He set it on the nightstand and turned off the light and slept the sleep of a man who has finished one story and is only now beginning to understand the dimensions of the next one. There is a lesson in what Solomon Bridges did, and it is not about revenge, it is not about power or patience or the satisfaction of watching arrogance collapse under its own weight, though all of those things are present in this story. The lesson is simpler than any of that. It is this: the people who count you out do not get to determine your ceiling. They only get to determine their own floor. And some people, given enough time and enough quiet, will build something so far above that floor that the people standing on it will not even be able to see it. Solomon Bridges saw it the whole time. He just did not announce it. Now, before you go, what would you have done in Solomon's position? If you had that kind of power and that kind of patience, would you have walked into that ballroom? Would you have attended that gala knowing what you knew? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to read every single one. And if this story moved you, hit that like button one more time on your way out. It tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to be heard, and that is how we keep bringing them to you. We will see you in the next one. There is always another story, and it is always worth the wait.